Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Usman Butt. Over a decade ago, the world was fixated on the emergence of Daesh, or so-called Islamic State, the terror group that took control of vast swathes of territory across Syria and Iraq. Daesh governed the lives of millions of people and ran a vast police state. Their defeat in 2017 led to concerns that their crimes would soon be forgotten, and what people endured would be swept under the carpet. A new online archive aims to preserve and educate people about some of the atrocities committed by the group. ISIS Prisons Museum is a virtual museum space that uses state-of-the-art technology to forensically investigate their crimes and tell the stories that promote awareness of what happened in Daesh custody. Joining us now is Robin Yassin-Kassab. Robin Yassin-Kassab is the chief English editor of ISIS Prisons Museum. He is also the author of the book The Road from Damascus, a novel, and co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War. He is the deputy editor and contributor of essays to The Critical Muslim, all of which I recommend people check out. Robin, welcome to Memo Conversations.
Thank you for having me, Osman.
So, ISIS Prisons Museum, I mean, this is a very interesting initiative. I had the good fortune of attending the launch party you had for it at here in London. But obviously, this is a virtual archive. But I'm sort of wondering if we can go back to the beginning. So, tell us about the sort of genesis of this project. How did this idea emerge, and why did was it felt it was important?
Well, this is a grassroots Syrian and Iraqi effort. And it began really with Syrian journalists who'd been doing a lot of important work during the anti-Assad revolution in Syria to make contacts with the international media, to train up citizen journalists to write their own stories and make their own documentaries on what was happening in Syria. Of course, that brought them to the attention of the Assad regime, and many of the core team of what later became the ISIS Prisons Museum were arrested and abused in Assad prisons. And then after 2013, when ISIS turned up, several of them were arrested and abused by ISIS, the next authoritarian thing that came along. And in particular, one of them disappeared. You know, there's a photojournalist called Mohammed Noor Matar, who was arrested by ISIS and then disappeared, as tens of thousands of Syrians and Iraqis disappeared into these prisons and never came out. So the Mohammed Noor's brother, Amir Matar, is actually the director of the ISIS Prisons Museum. And Amir and his colleagues, as soon as ISIS vacated the positions that it had held in Raqqa and other parts of Syria and Iraq, they went down into all of these buildings which they'd used as prisons. And the original motivation was they were looking for people like Mohammed Noor. They were looking for their colleagues and friends and neighbors who had been arrested and disappeared in these prisons. Now, they didn't find any trace of Mohammed Noor, unfortunately, but they did find lots of other stuff, lots of other evidence. And they decided that it was important to document this evidence because, you know, maybe they hadn't found Mohammed Noor, but there were tens of thousands of other families looking for information about their disappeared relatives. And the original impetus was to help those people. But now it's grown and it's become something which can help, I hope, the whole world learn more about what happened.
Indeed, indeed. And so this is something that's been going on for years. I mean, obviously you've launched recently, but this is something you've been working on for years. So tell me about, obviously now you've gone from a process where you have a grassroots initiative in Iraq and Syria, and it's mostly about trying to uncover what happened to people. This is mostly an informational thing in a sense that you're trying to reach out to families and let them know what happened to their relatives and seeing if you can find things out that way. How did it sort of turn into this idea that, okay, we want to do something more than that? We want to actually turn this into a project, a museum that other people from everywhere else can access?
Well, I suppose the motivation was that then there needs to be more information out there. People still, after years of war and international involvement, a lot of people still don't know much about what happened in Syria, or even what's happening in Iraq, apart from the fact that there was an American invasion at a certain point. People kind of lost the story a bit after that. So, and of course, we all tend to be, Arabs, Muslims, particularly Syrians and Iraqis, often tend to be tarred with the same brush, and we want people to know that, look, many ISIS members were Syrians, and the core of the organization was Iraqi. And of course, they attracted people from all over the world. But most of the victims of this organization were Syrians and Iraqis. There's a huge amount of diversity of people and of opinions in Syria and Iraq. So we wanted some of that to get across. But also, I think just the huge amount of information that we gathered needed a complicated platform and has lots of different potential audiences. So let me talk a little bit, if I may, about that. I mean, for a start, the prisons themselves, the buildings, the sites that had been used as prisons were evidence which was being lost. And let me explain what I mean. These prisons, ISIS, when it went into a new town or city, it took over all kinds of buildings and turned them into prisons. A secondary school, a sports stadium, a gymnasium, a shopping center, private family homes. I mean, every conceived churches, they took over all the churches they could, and most of them they turned into prisons. Every conceivable type of building they turned into prisons. And these buildings, a lot of them were, when our team first went in, a lot of these buildings were either being demolished or falling to pieces because they'd been bombed, they were suffering battle damage, or the original owners of the building wanted to obviously reclaim them and restore them. So there was information being lost. So the first thing they did was they went in and they filmed every inch of every wall 360 degrees using 360-degree cameras. They also found names on the walls, names scratched on the walls. And this showed us first that probably this was a cell, that prisoners were held here, and they'd scratched their names or messages or lines of scripture or poetry on the walls, which in a way were kind of messages to their families, to the people back home. And then the architecture as well. We did a kind of forensic analysis of the architecture, and we found that, ISIS had made lots of changes. It had installed solitary confinement blocks, for example. It had put hooks on the walls and the ceilings to hang people from when it was going to whip them and torture them. So all of this was very carefully documented. And we also found documents, which, if you like, I can tell you about because that's a big part of it. I'll go on. We found
tell us about the documents. Yes.
Thank you. We found over 70,000 documents, and some of those were on paper, some of them were printed out, some of them were on computer hard drives. It includes also audio documents, audio recordings of interrogations, passports, personal information about the ISIS members, the people who had acted as informants for ISIS, and then lots and lots of information, arrest warrants and transfer documents, interrogation documents, sentencing documents about the people who had passed through the ISIS detention and surveillance and torture system. All of these documents are being uploaded at the moment. A little over half of them have been properly uploaded into our archive, which is a searchable database, which uses the same software. It's called Lincurious, which was used for the Panama Papers investigation, which is a very useful tool. You can put a name into this thing, and you can then, it gives you a visual representation of relations between entities. So if you put a name in, you'll find out you'll see lines going to all the documents in which this person's name appears, all the prisons and sites and positions associated with this person. And then another thing we did, how did we work out precisely what had happened in each room of these prisons, that was based on witness testimony.
I know. So tell us more about this witness testimony and its collection.
Sure. Okay. So this was done by networking. Basically, it was finding out who was asking around who were in these prisons. And when we found somebody who was in one of these prisons, we asked him or her who was in the prison with you at the same time. And we went looking for these people and networked until we've got hundreds of witnesses and hundreds or probably thousands now of hours of witness testimony, which usually involves the ex-prisoners, the former prisoners, standing in the buildings in which they were imprisoned, talking about, exactly what happened to them in which part of which room, and when. And by cross-referencing all of this, all of these different witness testimonies with the forensic evidence and with the documents too, we built up a very careful picture of what had happened and what had happened precisely in each room. So that's one of the things that we've got on the website is 3D tours of these different prisons. And we'll be uploading more every few weeks, more prisons to come. And you can go through these prisons and you can learn exactly what happened. And that, of course, is evidence. And this kind of evidence has already been used in war crimes trials.
So I have a question here about the interviews, because of course, when you approach people, and obviously you're doing it through networks that you use locally, but you still have to be careful about how the interviewing is done, because obviously you do want the information, but you want to respect that person and you want to make sure you're not causing more issues for them. So how did your teams sort of go about all of that? Like not just simply identifying, but making sure that A, they're comfortable talking, and B, whatever they say doesn't have a negative consequence on them.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is that the people that you actually see on the website are incredibly brave people, because they are potentially putting themselves in danger. Some of those people still live in areas where ISIS is active. So what I think the key term is informed consent, that we constantly ask them for their informed consent, which doesn't just mean saying, are you okay with this, but explaining this could have negative effects, And some people have agreed to talk to us, but not for us to publicize who they are. But a lot of people said yes, that you can use our faces and our names and our voices on your website in public. And we've said to them, "Are you aware that this could potentially put you in danger?" And in most cases they've said, "Yeah, but that's okay because I want people to know what happened. I want accountability, and I want people to be aware of what happened."
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of motivation. They want to raise awareness regardless of what might happen, because I suppose, this terrible thing did happen to them and they want people to know that it happened. But you've spoken a bit about talking to people who are obviously the victims of these prisons. Did any of your teams ever get to talk to any of the actual perpetrators themselves? I mean, obviously, a lot of ISIS people are now in prison camps and so on. And there are still, as we will later learn, there are still some in operation now.
Yeah. At least, several actually, and at least two that I can think of that we've dealt with recently. One person, if you maybe maybe a bit later, we'll talk about the stadium special investigation and topic which we've launched the website with. But one of the articles there is an interview with somebody that we've called the chameleon. And this was somebody who worked in ISIS prisons in a service capacity. So he was doing a kind of technical service job. He wasn't involved in torturing or hurting anybody. And we have and he's called the chameleon because it's an interesting story, because this is a guy that started off working for the Assad regime and then defected from the Assad regime, went home to Raqqa, his hometown, ended up working in a prison run by Islamist groups, Islamist militias. Then when ISIS took over from those Islamist militias, he transferred and kept on doing the same job in an ISIS prison, in the Stadium prison. And today he's working in the SDF prisons, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces prisons, which are, run by the dominant group in there is the Kurdish PYD. So he's moved from one prison system to another, which is why we've called him the chameleon. And we did use his information. He gave us some interesting and useful information, which of course we had to cross-reference with other sources of information. And we've also talked to somebody who I would say is more guilty, somebody called Abu Saif, actually, who that was his, we know his real name, but his kind of nom de guerre was Abu Saif. And he was an investigator, an interrogator for the Hisba Diwan, which was like the ISIS morality police, if you like. And we have interviewed him and cross-referenced what he's said with other testimonies in order to get information. And I think a text is being written about his interview, but we're not going to show his interview because we've made quite a firm decision that we don't want to amplify the voices of the perpetrators. We want to amplify the voices of the victims. And we're very careful not to show any ISIS propaganda. It would be easy, of course, because ISIS had a great big media operation. They still have a media operation, but it used to be quite sophisticated when they saw themselves as a state and they controlled vast swathes of Syria and Iraq. And it would be easy just to kind of rely on a lot of the videos and things and photographs which they themselves put out. But we don't want to do that. We look at that stuff if we need to, but we're not going to publicize any of that or publish any of that on our website because, as I say, the idea is to amplify the voices of the victims, not of the perpetrators.
I do sort of wonder if the chameleon has a LinkedIn profile where he says how to get a job for life.
Indeed.
But the other guy, the other prison guard you mentioned, what do you sort of know about his background before he joins? I mean, it's interesting you say he was involved in interrogations and investigations for the morality police, but was he somebody who had, say, a background in investigations before, or was it just like many people, he did one job one day and then they came along and he just joined?
I don't want to go into too much detail because I haven't done a proper study of this guy myself and I don't have the details at my hand. I don't want to slander him too much, but I do know that several witnesses, ex-prisoners, said that guy was actually known as a bit of a delinquent. He was known as a guy who had problems with drugs and was unemployed and wasn't much use. And then suddenly when ISIS took over, he became something and decided that he was going to start interrogating people about their moral behavior and their knowledge of religion and so on. And I think this was often the case. I think there were lots of different motivations for joining ISIS, from the ideological to the economic to the just looking for a job, all kinds. But a lot of it in both Syria and Iraq was that people who had hitherto not been very well respected, not had much social authority, saw this as a way of getting some social authority and in some cases getting revenge on people that had maybe thought that they were better than them and so on. So there is an element of that, yeah.
So I want to ask you quickly about the documents. As you mentioned, there are 70,000 documents. What was your process like for trying to go through all of them and decide on how to sort of use those documents? Because it's not just you're going through them, you're also publishing some of them, you're also using and mining it for information for the website to build things. So could you perhaps talk to us about the process of actually going through it all?
Yeah, not my job, but we have archivists working for us. And I think the important thing there is to sort them according to keywords so that they could be entered onto the searchable database. And the keywords would include names of people, names of places, names of prisons, dates, and then specific areas of interest. For example, is this connected to the Yazidi genocide? Is this connected to the treatment of Christians or other minorities? Is this connected to the Shaitat massacre, the massacre of the Shaitat clan? So looking for keywords, sorting them according to keywords was the first thing. And then in terms of displaying them on the website, we do display a few documents, not many. We display a few documents on the website. For every special topic which comes up on the website, there will be a catalogue of relevant documents which we retrieved in the prison that we're talking about, or documents which are relevant to the topic which we're talking about. And those are usually redacted. We've blacked out the names of people and key information, because as you were hinted at earlier, talking about witnesses, we have to be careful here, because we don't want accusations against people to be out there in public and to cause social problems or revenge attacks and or family issues and so on. So we've redacted names in most cases, and we've just put up a few things up on the public website in order to give an example, show people an example, a sample of what we've got. However, the documents are available if people want to get in touch with us from legal tribunals, legal teams, academics, journalists, people with a specialist interest who have a good reason for looking at the original documents. They can get in touch with us at the ISIS Prisons Museum, and they can explain to us why they would like to work in partnership with us. They would like to do a search of our database, and we can set up a researcher to work with them. But we are not just giving it out to everybody. Certainly, we don't, for example, want to give it out to governments. We don't want to learn that there are drone strikes happening on villages around the world because some government has got one of our documents and has decided to use it in that way. We don't want to cause more suffering and pain. We want to cause some accountability.
Okay, that's one of my questions as well about because since you obviously, you've only just publicly launched, but you've been building this for a while. What interaction have you had with, for example, investigators, war crimes investigators, courts? Have they shown an interest in this sort of stuff?
Yes, there's, for example, in Germany, there has been one court case so far in which some people have been sent to prison for their connection to the massacre of the Shaitat clan in eastern Syria, in Deir ez-Zor. And they have used, in that case, that court got in touch with us and said, what information do you have on the massacre of the Shaitat clan? And we did have some documents, but we then actually kind of went out and did a special investigation in concert with with members of the Shaitat clan, actually. We've done special investigations into buildings in Shaitat villages, which we used as prison and execution sites. So that's the first example of a successful use of our material by a war crimes tribunal. But I think there will be a lot more. There's certainly a lot of interest in it by international organizations and legal tribunals.
So yes, you've told us a bit about the processes now, but could you perhaps now tell us a little bit about, because on the launch, you told us about the story of the Black Stadium prison in Raqqa, and it was originally a children's sports stadium, if I remember correctly, and that was converted into a jail. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about the evolution of that as a site from a place where people, played sport into a prison and to whatever it is becoming now? And could you tell us about the evolution of the site and what this tells us?
Yeah, the story even goes back from before it was used as a sports stadium by children and adults too, because it was designated, I think, back in the 1970s. It was designated, the area was designated for a sports stadium by the Assad regime, the Hafiz al-Assad regime, the father of the president, the current president. But it took, and they built a perimeter wall but it took decades for work to actually start, which kind of sums up the inefficiency of the bureaucratic Ba'athist dictatorship. In those years, it was on the outskirts of Raqqa, but the city grew around it until it became quite a central part of Raqqa. And the wall, the perimeter wall, went black with traffic fumes, which is why the place became known as the Black Stadium. Eventually, a stadium was built in there, and a generation of young people in Raqqa knew it as a place where they went to play sports and games, chess and things as well. There were lots of rooms underneath the stadium. There was a wedding hall and places for all kinds of public activities. When the revolution broke out against the Assad regime in 2011, it was suspended. The regime closed it down because it didn't want any kind of public gatherings. When the regime was kicked out of Raqqa, for a couple of weeks, the place was used as a media center by civic activists, by democratic revolutionaries. You know, these were the people that everybody had hoped were going to play a big role in the new Syria, but very quickly they were, which in a way, again, it's the story of the whole thing, that they were shunted out of the way, and armed Islamist militias and jihadi militias, including Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, took over the site, and they set up a Sharia court, what they called a Sharia court, in the rooms underneath the stadium. And it was also a detention center. It wasn't exactly a prison, but they detained people there temporarily while judging them. It was supposed to be a place for reconciling local people and, adjudicating local disputes, but there were also some civil activists arrested for silly reasons by these authoritarian militias. And then ISIS took over from the other militias. ISIS, the distinction between ISIS and the rest of the revolution, including the Islamist and jihadist groups, became very clear. It became very obvious that ISIS was not interested in collaborating with other parts of Syrian society, that actually it saw the Syrian revolution as its enemy, just as Assad did, and it wanted to take over completely and absolutely from them and set up its own totalitarian state. So it took over the stadium and it turned it into a very nasty security prison, as it called it, a security prison in which they put people that they considered their political and military enemies. Now, some of those people, okay, you can understand that they were political or military enemies because they had joined the Free Syrian Army, or they had a history of being involved with the Assad regime. They had maybe fought against ISIS in some way or other. But many of the people, or most of the people in there, were people who had done things like, for example, they'd accessed the internet at home rather than through an ISIS-controlled internet cafe. Or they had phoned up a relative who had gone to live in Turkey, who'd run away from Raqqa and was living in a refugee camp or a city in Turkey. They'd phoned them up, and that was their crime. And because they'd spoken to somebody outside of ISIS territory, they were considered to be spies who were probably sending, important information without any proof at all. And anybody who disagreed in any way, anybody who expressed any kind of public opposition to ISIS, men of religion who didn't pledge allegiance to ISIS, who didn't accept their version of Islam, were considered to be political enemies, and they were put in this place. And it was a detention center. It was a torture. Very similar to what the Assad regime did. Remember that ISIS learnt from the Ba'athist system, because so many high up people in ISIS had been security officers in the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq in the past. So many of them had been through the prison systems of Assad or Saddam Hussein or Shia militias in Iraq, or the Americans in Iraq. They'd experienced all kinds of maltreatment and torture, and they'd learnt from it, and they wanted to do the same thing. They, like the Ba'athist regimes, they ruled by fear. So it was important that people outside the prison be terrified of what was happening inside the prison. And the whole of society became a kind of projection of the prisons. So it became a big prison, you know. And that's what they did in the stadium. They hung people on. I mean, I don't know if I should go into all the details, but you can read them on the website because we've launched with the website. But all kinds of torture with electricity and with whipping, with cables, with hoses, hanging people on hooks for hours on end from their wrists or their ankles, hanging them upside down. And people were also executed. People were tortured to death. People were put in solitary confinement for days on end and fed very little. In some cases, you got up to 7 people crammed into a tiny solitary confinement cell and kept there for days on end, living in their own excrement. I mean, really barbaric, terrible conditions. And of course, very shameful that it was done in the name of Islam when it was, you know, such an outrage against any moral system.
Indeed, indeed. And when because you've also talked about, you know, the fact that this was one of the things you used in the launch. But why did the Prisons Project decide to launch with this particular prison site over others?
We've actually launched with 2. We've launched with both the stadium, which is the biggest security prison, as they called it, security prison, because there were other kinds of prisons we can talk about, but it was the biggest security prison in Syria, and the Ahdath prison, or the juvenile prison, which was the biggest security prison in Mosul in Iraq. And we decided to open with those probably just because they're big, you know, they're really big and dramatic. We've done a huge amount of work on them. We wanted to launch with one thing from Syria and one thing from Iraq to show that we're covering both countries right from the very start. And I think that's the reason, because they were security prisons. The Ahdath prison, the juvenile prison, is so called because it was actually first built in the 1980s in Iraq as an orphanage. Again, it's a story of increasing authoritarianism. And then it became a juvenile detention center. And then after the American invasion, the new Iraqi government used it as a place to detain insurgents or terrorists. So the kind of Sunni extremists who later joined ISIS were imprisoned in there. And then the lunatics took over the asylum. When ISIS took over Mosul, they took over that prison and they used it as a security prison, but they only controlled it for 42 days. They killed a lot of people there, but they only controlled it for 42 days until it was bombed by by the global coalition, bombed the site, and dozens of prisoners were killed in that bombing. And after that, it was no longer used as a prison. So we've opened with these 2 large prisons, I think because they're so big, because they were big, dramatic security prisons, one in Syria, one in Iraq.
Yes, and you've mentioned obviously there are other prisons, of course, and we're going to get it onto in a second, you know, all the other stuff you might be launching in the future. But could you give us an idea, how many prisons do we think ISIS were operating?
I can't give you an actual number because we are discovering more all the time, but dozens and possibly hundreds. I mean, certainly almost 100, I think, that we've kind of looked at the moment, but more are being discovered. And there's also mass graves, which is another part of our work, is to examine and analyze as much as we can mass graves and who's in those mass graves and who put them there. So lots. I mean, prisons were absolutely central to ISIS rule, as they were central to Assad rule and, you know, other authoritarian systems. And that was, you know, one of the first things they did when they arrived in a new place was they found a prison, and they terrified the local population by putting people in there.
And what do you think? So from looking at all the sort of different documents, the arrest documents, what people were being put in prison for, what did this tell you about what ISIS cared about? I mean, obviously we've mentioned fear, but in terms of crimes that they were accusing people of and what they thought was worthy of imprisonment, what does this sort of tell us about what mattered to ISIS?
I think, totalitarian control. It was a totalitarian organization in the model of the Ba'athist regimes which preceded it. It was totalitarian, and I think the way in which that affected the ordinary people the most was through the Hisb Diwan. So the Hisb Diwan, or the kind of how would you translate it? The accountability um, directorate
Ministry.
or department or ministry or something. And the Hisb Diwan was a kind of morality police. And therefore, that was the way in which ordinary people who didn't want anything to do with politics or with fighting or with theological disputes, they just wanted to get on with their lives. That's how most of them experienced the horror of ISIS. People who just were going about their day not expecting anything to happen, and suddenly they're grabbed and they find themselves in a dungeon being harassed and tortured and whipped. It could be because they were wearing tight trousers, or because they'd cut their beard too short, or because they were smoking cigarettes. That was absolutely banned by ISIS. And of course, Syrians and many Iraqis are terrible nicotine addicts. So that was a terrible thing. I keep thinking about the story of a woman. I don't know why. I've seen her interview several times and she just sticks in my head. This ordinary working class, an extraordinary, ordinary person, and a working class woman who worked as a cleaner in a hospital in Raqqa, and she'd just finished a night shift cleaning and was standing outside the hospital. She thought by herself, waiting for the minibus to come and pick her up to take her home. And she was exhausted, so she got out a cigarette and lit the cigarette. Now, I gave up, thank God, 3 years ago. So, but I can remember that feeling when I was a smoker. I'm glad I'm not anymore, but I remember that feeling. Oh, I'm exhausted. I just want a cigarette. And that's what happened to this woman. She had a cigarette, and next thing she knew, she heard a van coming up, but it wasn't the van to take her home. It was an ISIS patrol. And the next thing she knew, she was pushed into a van being beaten. She was taken to a family home, which had been confiscated and was used as a prison. And she was beaten and beaten and beaten, including on her abdomen with a glass cola bottle, until she started bleeding. And then she was taken back to the hospital that she'd just been cleaning, and discovered that she was having a miscarriage as a result of this beating. This was a woman who'd been praying for 10 years for God to make her pregnant. And God answered her prayer, and then ISIS came and, murdered the answer. So that kind of thing, I think, why were they arresting people for such stupid reasons? There were also people walking in the street with their female relatives. Nothing in Islam or in Sharia stops you walking in the street with your cousin or your aunt. But people were arrested and detained and tortured for these supposed offences, for having a musical ringtone on your phone, for the most silly things. And I think what that is about totalitarian control. It's about ruling society through fear, and about the state, whatever the nature of the state, having absolute control over all aspects of people's lives. Which is a larger disease in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world, this idea that the state should have absolute control over people's lives, the state should be strong and society should be weak.
How much do you think then on these arrests were centrally directed? Because there's obviously this thing where, ISIS would say we want certain clampdowns, and then obviously you have local units who have to sort of say, okay, well, we want to arrest this many people, or and so we go out and do it. Or to what extent also was it individuals in those local areas, those local commanders, those local arresters, people who do the arresting, just deciding I'm going to arrest that person?
Um, again, because it's such a careful investigative journalism project, I'm slightly wary of giving a full answer to your question, because the honest answer is I haven't done a proper investigation into that, so I can't really tell you. But from what I do know, I think it was both. I think that the centralized directive was to rule over these communities with an iron fist. You know everything that's happening. If somebody's shaved their beard, you have to know if they've shaved their beard. If somebody is smoking a cigarette, you need to know that. If somebody is, following a Sufi sheikh privately, you need to know. You need a network of informers to know everything. So I think that was a central directive, the absolute totalitarian penetration of all parts of society. Having said that, a lot was left to the local guys, the zealous people who felt like big men because they suddenly had a little bit of power over their neighbors, including, in many cases, shamefully, the Muslims that came from Europe. The Muslims that came from Europe and decided that they knew better than the local people how Islam should be practiced in Raqqa, and what the people in Raqqa should be wearing, and what their personal speech should involve, and so on. So I think there was a lot of that. And in fact, in the case of the Shaitat clan, there was a fatwa was made by a high up ISIS guy, a sheikh, that the Shaitat could be killed because they were apostates. They were apostates, murtaddin. They were apostates who had rejected religion because they had rejected the rule of ISIS. So therefore, because ISIS was the representative of Islam, they had rejected Islam, so they could be killed, all of them. And afterwards, though, it seems that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was not happy with the extent to which the Shaitat clan had been slaughtered, and worried. I think there was some attempt to kind of, okay, let's slow this thing down, let's ease the oppression a little bit. I think they were worried there for political reasons, that if we outrage, the Shaitat clan is part of a much larger tribe, the Aqidat, which has Iraqi members as well, and we could cause ourselves political trouble. So there were instances where the overzealousness of local forces was slowed down by people in the center.
So could you perhaps tell us more now then about what is to come, what you're going to be releasing, and also what your sort of schedule, because my understanding is you're going to be doing quite a lot of different prisons and documentations and things that you're going to release. So what is to come, and what is the sort of schedule for all of this?
Yeah, every, let's say, I don't want to give an absolute date, but every 6 weeks, 2 months, we will upload a new topic. And each topic will involve 3D tours of prisons, or it could be an urban site or a mass grave, special investigations, a catalogue of relevant documents, witness testimonies, and more. As I said, the first one has been the stadium and the Ahdath prison. Next is coming the Shaitat clan, the massacre of the Shaitat clan, which we've talked about a little bit. And then in the future, there's going to be all kinds of special focuses. For example, the treatment of Christians in detail. Christians were treated slightly differently in different parts of Syria and Iraq, depending on various factors. The Yazidis, of course, the slaughter of Yazidi men and the enslavement or sexual enslavement of Yazidi women and children. There were special prisons, these are heartbreaking. I mean, special prisons in which Yazidi women and children were held in the dark. And we found, for example, on the walls of those prisons, children's drawings of what was happening to them. What else? The treatment of other minority groups, the specific focus on specific battles, specific areas, specific prisons. There will be a great big huge focus on the Hespa Diwan, which we talked about before. One of the documents that we've got is a 106-page text written by ISIS. They were very bureaucratic, which details all the workings of the Hisba Diwan and the various things that they saw as offences and the recommended punishments for these different offences. So we've written a great big investigative report on all of that. We've focused on various Hisba prisons and so on. So I hope that people won't come once to the website. They will keep coming back every couple of months, and each time they come back, they'll see much more there.
So what's the sort of plans? Because obviously you've talked about, putting all these documents online, not putting up, but pushing articles that investigate what is happening. But are you just going to be doing written pieces, or are there visuals you plan to go with it to sort of, because obviously you've done 3Ds for the actual prisons themselves. I'm just wondering whether there's more visuals connected to the articles that you're going to be doing.
Definitely, there's reconstructions of crime scenes, which are in the 3D tours. In the 3D tours, you can see the prison as it was, or the building, the site as it was when our team went there, got in there first, and filmed 360 degrees. And then you can press a button to see a reconstruction of the crime scene, of the scene when ISIS was there abusing people. And there's more than that. In some cases, you will also see a reconstruction of or an artist's impression, if you like, of what the place was like before it was destroyed, before it was turned into a prison. And there's more visual stuff. There's artwork. We're working with, our extended team has over 100 people. And that's people on the ground in Syria and Iraq, photographers and journalists and interviewers and so on. We've got archivists, we've got architects, we've got technical people and artists that we're working with to do all kinds of work.
That's very. It sounds like it's going to be, you're going to be producing stuff for a very long time to come. It sort of reminds me a little bit of things like forensic architecture and those other sorts of projects where they've done very similar things to this. Have you actually had much cooperation from these sorts of groups? Not necessarily forensic architecture particularly, but
I think we're in touch with people like that, and forensic architecture definitely was an influence, because the work that Ayal Weizmann has done there has been really remarkable, and it's changed the way people approach this kind of thing. And so, yeah, certainly that was a great influence on what we're doing. I mean, dare I say it? I think our project is a little bit wider, because it's not just focusing on, it is certainly, that's at the base of it, is that we're focusing on the sites themselves, but then we're also bringing in a lot of witness testimony. We're trying to create a national memory resource for Syrians and Iraqis, and we're doing more and more investigative journalism, trying to draw connections between everything. Another thing that we're doing is there's a section which is currently called articles, but I think its name may change. It's on the website. I think its name may change to comparative experiences or something like that. We're gathering accounts of imprisonment, not just under ISIS, but under different prison systems regionally and globally, because they do all connect. It's very interesting. We've got to do with ISIS. For example, there was a French hostage, a journalist called Nicolas Henin, who wrote a very good book about Syria called Jihad Academy. He was held hostage by ISIS, and he's never written previously an account of that experience. But for us, he did. I think he found it quite painful to do, but he's written a brilliant account, which is not yet there, but it will be. But then other people too, Muazzam Beg, the British guy who was in Guantanamo Bay, has written us a very interesting account of his time in Guantanamo Bay, where the Americans threatened him, if you don't talk, we will send you to Syria. We will send you to Assad's prisons, and they will make you talk, because they really know how to torture people. Which is interesting. People often think that the Americans and the Assad regime are enemies, but here you see these the prison and the detention systems and surveillance systems and torture systems, their techniques cross borders, ideological borders and national borders, much easier than people do. And for that reason, we're gathering accounts of imprisonment in Assad prisons, in Saddam Hussein prisons, in American occupation in Iraq prisons, Egyptian prisons. We've got an account by Suha Bishara of her imprisonment in Khayyam prison in South Lebanon when that was controlled by the Israelis. And we're gathering more and more. We're extending that because I think it's very interesting to see that ISIS didn't just come out of a vacuum. Some people tend to think, oh, ISIS is just a kind of weird alien thing which arrived from nowhere. But no, it's one turn in the circle of, the vicious circle, the downward spiral of authoritarianism and oppression and violence, which has racked the region and the world.
Okay, that's very interesting. So you're sort of expanding it outwards, and it's just going to become the prisons project by the sounds of it, or at least that would be a component of it. But I think it's a very interesting thing you're discussing here, which is that obviously Daesh didn't come out of nowhere. It draws upon a lot of different influences. And I think that sort of side of things is poorly understood, as many things are poorly understood. But I've got sort of two more questions left. The first one is, how much do you think we now know about Daesh's atrocities, and how much do we think there's still to learn?
Okay, I mean, I think we've learned a hell of a lot. We really have, from a lot of different people, a lot of different sources, to be fair. It's not just us who have tens of thousands of documents. I know that, for example, Christoph Reuter, the German journalist who did a story in Der Spiegel, which proved basically the relations between the Assad regime and ISIS going back to when it was the Islamic State in Iraq. He got that story in part by buying a lot of ISIS documents. And there are various people around the place who have a lot of ISIS documents. We need to kind of join up these different efforts and try and get all of this stuff together, or so that it can interact in some way, so that we can get access to it at once. We know a lot by looking at these documents precisely because ISIS was such a bureaucratic organization. It saw itself as a state, and therefore, like a state, it carefully, bureaucratically described everything that it was doing. It wanted fatwas from its religious authorities. And the fatwas, they would contort, in some cases, they would contort Sharia. In some cases, they couldn't find Sharia justification for what they were doing. When they set fire to the Jordanian pilot, Mu'adh al-Qasasbi, for example, they couldn't find a justification for that in Sharia because it's so strongly against Sharia to burn anybody, even a dead body. But they found an example in history, So when everything they did, they justified. They made videos about it. They registered it. They wrote it down. And because their collapse at the time was so sudden and total, a lot of their documents were left behind. So we do know a lot about it. How much more is there to know? A huge amount. There's lots that we don't know. As I said, there are tens of thousands of people. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know where they are. We are investigating mass graves. And in a lot of these mass graves, ISIS put people that they'd murdered into these mass graves. Sometimes ISIS buried people Islamically in those mass graves. So they were probably their own people who had been killed in bombing or in fighting, but they didn't have time to bury them individually. It seems in some of those mass graves go back, and Assad regime or Saddam Hussein regime or Iraqi Shia militias had put people in those mass graves. Criminal gangs had put people in those mass graves. So there's a lot to be investigated. We need DNA teams. That's something that we can't do. We need experts in DNA analysis to try and work out who all these people are. There's a lot more to learn. And unfortunately, we need to understand it's not just about learning information. It's about the people in power being able to have the wisdom to understand where all of this comes from, and to have, better long-term policies which will try and stop this happening again and again and again. Because as I said, ISIS was just one turn in the wheel. ISIS is still there. It still exists in both Syria and Iraq. It's actually reconstituting itself. The number of attacks in Syria by ISIS is a lot more this year than it was at this time last year. So they're expanding and growing again. They keep coming out of their hiding places in the deserts to assassinate people. And that's because all of the conditions which allowed them to thrive in the first place are still there. Syria is still suffering from a terrible, very unpopular dictatorship. The economy has cratered long ago. In Iraq, too, there is a serious question of legitimacy. There are sectarian problems. There's foreign involvement, Iranian, American, Russian in Syria, and so on. So all of the conditions of oppression which allowed them to thrive are still in place. So we need to not just have the information, we need to look at the information and think about the information and think about how we can stop this cycle continuing.
So my last question, because obviously we spent a lot of time, well, our podcast talking about Daesh and ISIS. I now want to sort of just ask you, just in general, what do you see as the future of Iraq and Syria?
Oh gosh, well now again, you're asking me now as Robin Yassin-Kassab and not necessarily as the chief English editor of the ISIS Prisons Museum, because our job is to, because people again have asked us this: what is your political position? What is your religious position? What do you think about Islam? Why is it not the Assad Prisons Museum or the American Prisons Museum? Well, the answer to that last one is it's not the Assad Prisons Museum, because the Assad regime unfortunately still exists and we don't have access to all of those prisons. But in our archive, we're gathering everything that we can. And as you suggested, maybe one day this will turn into a much larger, Middle East and North Africa prisons project, or a global prisons project. Whenever we get access to more prisons, we will go in and investigate. And as the ISIS Prisons Museum, we have no position. We have no religious or political position other than a basic adherence to the principles of human rights. If anybody of any side is abusing people's rights, then we're interested in going in and analyzing that and documenting that, finding all the information that we can about that and publishing it. But if you're asking me what I think the future is for Iraq and Syria, Allahu alim, yani God knows. It's such a mess, isn't it? I can tell you that certainly, I think in both countries there is a huge desire still, more than ever, for decent representative government, for some form of democracy, for real self-determination, which does not mean Iranian militias or Russia or America or Israel occupying sections of these countries and setting the agenda in these countries. The people of these countries who outside, when they're in Europe or America or in the Gulf, they tend to do very well, but at home they can't do very well because of this interlocking nexus of oppression. So many different people oppressing them. And I hope that we have that desire to get beyond this situation, and I hope we do. Today, as I'm talking to you, there's actually, maybe fairly surprisingly, for the first time in years, there is military action. The rebel groups in northwest Syria are launching an offensive towards Aleppo city. In the south of Syria, in Sweda, the Druze community for well over a year now has been demonstrating every day against Assad. There are serious efforts inside Iraq to try and get beyond the sectarian rule and the Iranian militia rule and so on. So I can't tell you what the future is. It's not going to be easy because the situation is such a mess. These countries are so traumatized, but everybody connected. I think the majority of Iraqis and Syrians want a much better future. So inshallah, eventually we'll get there. And I hope that efforts like the ISIS Prisons Museum, grassroots, high quality journalism and human rights work from the region will help in that journey.
Robin Yassin-Kassab, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me, Osman. It's a pleasure.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you missed this one and would like to catch up, or you'd like to watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.